£300 million is a lot of money, even for a bank. People are dying as a result of boards making bad decisions. Don't think about the money, think about people losing their lives. Workplaces, organisations are systems. They're complex human social groups. No one person is responsible on their own. Lots of people knew what was going on, but couldn't be heard. Oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about it like that. Is that how it's going to play out? The letter of last resort is written by every British Prime Minister the moment after they enter 10 Downing Street. Is only opened in the event that Britain's been attacked by nuclear weapons and there is no communication from government. What do you do? And you can't think of a bigger question because we're in the middle of a nuclear exchange.
Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom, the podcast that takes you behind closed doors to unpack the pivotal decisions that shaped organisations for better or worse. I'm Erika Eliasson-Norris, and each week I sit down with a senior leader who stood at the edge of a defining moment. A crisis, a turning point, a challenge where the stakes were high and the outcomes uncertain. These are the conversations you won't find in annual reports. Honest, strategic, and grounded in lived experience. Because governance isn't about theory, it's about pressure, people, and making the call. My guest today is Professor Roger Steare, known internationally as the corporate philosopher. His journey began in unexpected places. The son of a preacher man, he studied Western philosophy under Conrad Russell and chose a safe career as a banker in 1979. In 1981, he became a residential social worker with children in care from inner London boroughs, where he learnt a lot about the best and worst of humanity. Since then, Roger has advised some of the world's largest corporations, BP, HSBC, Barclays, and Nationwide. He brings deep experience working with CEOs and their teams, boards, and executives. Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom, Roger. Let's get into it.
It's lovely to be here.
What's one moment you've seen where moral clarity made all the difference in a boardroom decision?
Yeah, it's a question of which one, I guess, but I think the one of the early ones I was involved in supporting, and it was one of those things where a lot of people had to be involved in the decision, was one that actually had a big price ticket on it. So I was working with one of the major UK banks at around the time of the financial crisis. And they had a big moral issue around some employees enjoying a direct benefit pension scheme, which was expensive to the employer and very lucrative for the people who were retiring. And others, all the new employees, as you know, would have come in on a direct contribution pension scheme. So some people doing the same job on the same salary were going to get very different pensions. And the CEO in particular was very concerned that this was not fair. And the board agreed. The board was also interested in the fact that there was a lot of money at stake, and £300 million is a lot of money, even for a bank. So my intervention was to not only to talk to them about a moral reasoning framework, which I've written up in the book Ethicability, but more crucially, to help them create an environment where all the people involved, who had to be involved, felt that they were going to be part of that decision and became part of that decision. So we're talking about a workforce of, I think at the time, 70,000, something like that. So my crazy idea was to involve the trade unions and other employee groups, staff groups, in an open negotiation and discovery with the board and the CEO and the finance team. And for some reason, they trusted me and went with this. And they had an open book conversation where they laid out all the numbers and then laid out this unfair moral dilemma with people doing the same job, getting the same salary, going to benefit from very different pension schemes.
Is that approach something that you felt that they would have done without you being there?
No. it was very clear that that was unlikely because the history of those negotiations was one of confrontation with employee groups. We're not very good at that in this country. They're much better in Germany, where, of course, they have works councils by law. But we do not have in the UK a legal requirement for employees to be represented at board level. So in order to do this, we had to make something up, which was to create this informal process. And behind the scenes, I was, coaching the senior leaders around, how to be open, how to talk about the moral values that were critical here. And the core moral value here was one of fairness, justice as fairness. And after 6 months, they came with an agreed recommendation to all the employees. It was put to a vote. There was an overwhelming majority, a supermajority in favour of the adjustments to the pension scheme. So there was greater fairness. And obviously the bank and the shareholders were able to continue to fund both pension schemes in a way that was economically sustainable. And that, I think, is the one that's always stuck in my mind. And the CEO still talks about it today, even though he's no longer leading that company.
And what sort of things does he talk about with you when he recalls that?
I think really it's a combination of having a moral reasoning framework, having clarity and a discussion about what values like fairness actually mean. So fairness, for example, is not about equality, it's about equity. So fairness means, at a moral level, each according to their needs, not each according to their wants, and not each everybody, it's not about everybody getting the same. And we live in a society where, families have children. Some of those children are perfectly healthy, mentally and physically, others not. But our society currently, although it's difficult, does decide to spend more money supporting those children with greater needs.
Do you think that some of your values come from your earlier career around being a social worker?
Yes. And also from my father, who was a builder during the week. But on a Sunday, he was a Methodist preacher in the pulpit. So, literally a Protestant work ethic from him, but also from Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, his son. So I'm not that old that I studied history of Western philosophy with Bertrand Russell, although I had to critique his book. But I studied it with his son, Conrad Russell. And then after a couple of years in banking, I decided I wanted to do something with more meaning in life. For me, that's not to say that many bankers don't find meaning in their work. But for me, it was really working with children in care from inner London boroughs who were too challenging for children's homes to handle. So I worked in a community home with education in Sussex. So we took the kids out of London and put them in the country, and helped to instill in them a sense of decency and a sense of safety that they could then grow and develop and try and get over all the traumas they had experienced. So those, yes, from a personal point of view, I think that combination of deep thought about what it means to be human, plus the experience of moving from what I would call as a reasonably privileged middle-class background, but to then do what I call my practical MBA in life with kids who had very little and had been traumatized, were very shaping experiences for me. And when people say to me, and I'm sure they say to you, I've had a bad day at work, they may have done, but when you're dealing with a child who's high on drugs and is smashing the place up, and is deeply, deeply traumatized, and you try and keep them safe and at the same time protect them, but also protect others from them, that's a bad day at work or a tough day at work.
And bringing that back to the kind of boardroom decisions and the kind of crises, those sort of moments no doubt play on kind of your experiences, your values. And have there been times where you've felt that boards have been tested and pushed, and what does that look like, and how do you see that coming out in the behaviours and the way that people act in those situations?
I think that's a really important question, and my answer, and it's always my answer, and it's the technique that I ask them to practice, which philosophers call the golden rule. Put yourself in their shoes. Role play if necessary. So let's say, first of all, most people, certainly on corporate boards, are privileged. They've got enough money, more than enough money. They don't need to go to a food bank to feed themselves. But many of their customers are struggling. So in order to get some clarity, I invite them to get their head off their iPad, out of their 100, 200, 300 page decks, and stop and think about what it must be like to be living hand to mouth as a customer, or often as a colleague, an employee, and say, right, when you're making this decision, put yourself in those people's shoes and decide what is right, not for you, but for them, because they ultimately are your shareholders. It may not look like it, but they are, and they're the key stakeholders in your business. And there are, in the UK, 60 million of them, 70 million nearly, worldwide, approaching 9 billion fellow human beings. We need to get real when we're making these decisions and remember that outside of this bubble called the board meeting in a boardroom with fine food and wine before or after, life isn't like this.
Do you think that it comes from people's lived experiences that they behave and understand the world like this, or do you think that it comes from something else?
Partly from their lived experience, and a lot of the people that we've worked with, you and I have worked with, have striven to improve themselves and to perhaps, move from, my own background, which was lower middle class, to something different. I like to think of it as a sideways move. So yes, it's nice to have enough money, but I think people, and this is true for individuals and for organizations, if we can anthropomorphize them for a second, to answer the question, how much is enough? And a wise person once said, you only know that you're truly wealthy when you know you've had enough. And unfortunately, many people in boardrooms, many of the people we work with, and many of the organizations do not know the answer to that question. It's always J.D. Rockefeller's answer, just a little more. And that creates, I think, a real challenge, a fundamental moral purpose challenge for all boards. It doesn't matter what sector, private, public, third sector, social enterprises. We are facing polycrises as a species because we are hooked on, we're off our faces on more. And we have a philosophy of want, not need. And wants are, by definition, infinite. So I think it's a very complex answer. So partly lived experience. So that's the past. I think people in the present actually need to look to the future and ask themselves the questions. I mean, most board members that you and I work with are parents of teenagers, sometimes grandparents. I often ask them the questions, what sort of world do you want your teenage children, and if they're older, your grandchildren to grow up in? Because if we carry on like this, if we're not asking fundamental purpose questions about how are we and our organization helping to create a sustainable environment for Homo sapiens on Earth, then it doesn't matter what decision you make, you're going to get it wrong if you haven't asked that fundamental purpose question.
What role did fear or politics kind of play in the experiences that you had of boardrooms and those gritty decisions that CEOs and teams have had to make?
So I think that's a great question, and I have to answer it in two parts. So fear, first of all. Fear is a really important driver for us. It enables us to survive in a hostile world. But unfortunately, the workplace, and it includes boardrooms, is primarily driven by fear. And that fear comes in various guises. The principal one in business for leaders and managers and directors and NEDs and SIDs and chairs and CEOs is status anxiety. How am I going to be remembered? Am I going to make such a catastrophic mistake that I might lose my knighthood, or I'll lose all self-respect? Another fear is perhaps not having enough. Another fear is being shown, perhaps asking stupid questions, which are not stupid, they're really smart, but they sound stupid because they're not often asked in the boardroom. And one of the things that boards, I still think, need to engage in is much greater diversity of thought. So there's a lot of work done on gender and diversity, ethnic diversity, and so on. But where are the people who, like me, are neurodivergent and see things differently and experience things differently? And so there's a real fear of speaking up. There's a real fear of speaking the truth. You and I have both experienced board papers being prepared, and they go through umpteen committees in the organizations, and they're sanitized by the time they get to the board because no one wants to ask the real question. No one wants to declare the real truths behind the question, the decision that needs to be made. Because people, don't like to bring bad news. People don't like to bring real options to the board. They like to bring a recommendation. And that's already closed down at least half the discussion that needs to be had. So fear operates in a number of ways. Politics is deeply linked to that. And politics is a real challenge because it's about the use and abuse of power. One of the things I've said is that compliance is a false god, because compliance only works because people are afraid of consequences. So they're afraid of, if you like, those in power saying you broke the rules, you didn't follow process, therefore you're at fault. And compliance has now become an inadequate substitute for conscience. So politics and the use and abuse of power in the boardroom and throughout organizations is quite toxic and really dangerous. And so by having people who are willing to stand up and say, and there's a technique that I teach them for this, so it's safer, I really don't think that's right because of X, Y, and Z. Now, if they're coming outside of this socioeconomic, educated class of a board of executive and non-executive directors, that's really hard to say. But when they put themselves in the shoes of a customer or a colleague or a regulator or the tax man, it's amazing. That gives you a suit of armor so you can actually challenge, with impunity, if you like. And the technique is very simple. You just say, as a NED, if I was a customer, I might be thinking this about this discussion, or if I was a shareholder, and I'm not saying a big institutional shareholder, I'm talking about grannies and granddads who rely on us, the retail shareholders who are ultimately behind all this, who are looking at their pension, their occupational pension, and it's shrinking in value as inflation rises and so on. Are we thinking of them? Who's speaking up for them? And so you don't have to say, it's me saying this. What you say is, and obviously that's where the devil's advocate comes from. And I often have had to play that part. Unfortunately, sometimes it means that my consulting contract has not been renewed or terminated because I've been too awkward. But I'm always glad I've done it. I've never regretted speaking the truth from another person's perspective. And if that means that my work with that board or with that organization terminates, then so be it. There are others.
Yeah. Do you think that fear in politics then, if we're saying that it happens at all kind of decision-making stages, by the time it gets to the board, things could easily have been sanitized to such an extent, because if the person at the, let's say, the bottom of the food chain is sanitizing what they are saying to the next person up, a fear of or politics of, and then by the time it gets to the board, there could be a lot of information missing, for one, or a lot of misinformation or sanitized reports. What sort of impact does that have? Because
Huge.
we've seen that in corporate scandals, right, and collapse, and we didn't know, the board were not aware. How do we address that sort of thing?
So you're absolutely right. And it's so sanitized by the time it gets to board, because everybody's scared of their boss saying, you can't say that. They'll freak out.
Do you think that's true?
I do. I know, I've seen it.
Okay.
I've seen it. And I've often said, I'll take it. I'll take it. They can shoot me. I don't care. Because it's too important.
And what reaction did those sorts of things have in the boardroom?
Ultimately, they were grateful. But too often, as you'll know from my background, I've been pulled in after the bad things have happened. So financial scandals. So yes, it does get sanitized. And the solution is boards need to get out of the boardroom, get out of their board packs, get out off diligent, get out of their board packs, and actually go around the business. Go and visit retail outlets, go and visit contact centers, go and meet customers, find out what's really going on. Talk to employees, talk to colleagues. Now, when I've done culture audits, I do it as an anthropologist would do it. I don't sort of have a focus group with pre-prepared vanilla questions that people are prepared to, are willing to ask, but not the difficult ones. I create an environment where it's normally one-to-one or one-to-a-few, and we have a chat. And for some reason, people trust me and they open up. And that's true also for leadership teams. When I'm in the room, they very quickly realize, because I talk truths, I speak truths to them, and it's almost like an unburdening where they just come out with the truth. It's like a bleh. And that's where you find out what's going wrong. And the trick, certainly for non-executive directors, is to create that safety, to get out of that comfort zone, to get out of the sanitized bullshit story that they've been given, and actually go and really see what's going on and hear what's going on.
I've been in situations, though, where I've been in organisations where we've done exactly that, but the questions and the people to talk to have been sanitized, which is another challenge of itself, because then there's only certain answers that come back. Absolutely. And we don't talk to that person over there on that production line because there are a variety of different answers. They don't speak English. They don't understand what's going on. But actually, they may actually just speak the truth to power. And actually, that's too challenging. How would a non-exec director kind of identify those sorts of things? Because that's very challenging, right?
I think they have to insist that they choose who they're going to talk to.
Yeah.
And do it using random, doing a random system. Just get a random number generator to spew out employee numbers. And don't let anyone massage and micromanage the process. And when you see that happening, there's a problem. So when you see that process of sanitization and micromanagement, that the organization is designed to hide things, which is why we get all the scandals we're dealing with now. Royal Mail, Thames Water, all the water companies, a lot of the utilities, a lot of the things that we can go back over the last 20 years or longer and see all these scandals. PPI mis-selling, we've now got car finance mis-selling. These are multi-billion pound scandals, but crucially, people are dying as a result of boards making bad decisions. So the other thing I'd say is if you want to really find a reason for doing your job properly, is don't think about the money, think about people losing their lives.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's what it is. How many postmasters committed suicide as a result of wrongful prosecutions, allegedly, and so on. So, I think there is a moral obligation for board members, particularly the non-executive directors, to get out there and see it for themselves without having this, massaged vanilla stuff that they're presented with. And if it does look like that, then smell a rat.
As such, make it human.
Make
this
it
is about
human.
people.
It's messy. Humanity is messy, but it's joyful. And not only do you see and hear the pain, you also see and hear genuine fun and joy in the organizations. And that makes people feel good. So, my whole approach to life is that life is a contradiction. Life is, and working life and life is, a lot of moments of not much happening, but there are moments of joy and there are moments of deep sadness and pain. That's what life is about. And that's what working life is about. If we try and massage that view and present to ourselves and to our shareholders, our stakeholders, this massaged, and we haven't talked about annual reports yet, people, when they really see it as it is, and you can often see this actually in other investors. So in terms of private equity, they, in a way, are much more attuned to this because they have to get in and out pretty quickly. They can't afford to wait for 10 years for something to roll out. They're in it for 3. And smart, when they do their due diligence, they're not just looking at the numbers, they're doing a deep dive on the organizational psyche and what's really going on. And they employ psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists and occasionally philosophers to do it as well.
Yeah, big questions. You've studied how leaders think about right and wrong. What does good moral judgment look like in practice at board level? Can you go into some more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the Ethicability framework, which is 20 steps, it's one statement and then 19 questions.
Yeah, this is your book, right?
Indeed, thank you. And inside it is what I call the RIGHT framework. So the acronym is RIGHT. And that's the short version. So the letter R stands for rules. So when we're starting to make a moral decision, you start off with the fact that most or every workplace has a set of rules and laws and processes that have to be followed, not slavishly, which is the interesting thing. But the first thing you say is, what must we do and what must we not do in terms of the rules? But that will not tell you what's right. That's the compliance trap. And I've seen so many scandals caused by people simply following orders and following the rules. So the next one you go to is, what if you feel that the rules don't cover this situation, or the rules are in contradiction, which they often are? And so, for example, you might have a company policy, which actually you discover is at odds with human rights, or either at UK, European, or at international level. So the letter I, is the first letter of the word integrity. And integrity is the values word. So there's a lot of debate amongst moral philosophers about what the word integrity means. But the definition I share is integrity is the word that summarizes all the moral values we believe in, and people can see those moral values through our actions and behaviors. So in that sense, the word integrity is, if you like, the basket within which our moral values sit. But it's not just sitting there, it has to be a set of lived values. And what's challenging here with moral values is that most organizational values aren't moral values. They're things that the community or the group values, but they're not moral values. So moral values are quite limiting. quite limited. So the top three are love or compassion or kindness, number one. So that's our humanity, our care for others. People might call it empathy, weak word. Compassion is the strong word. The next one is fairness. And we've talked about fairness and the importance of each according to their needs. And then the third one is wisdom. And wisdom is the thing that's lacking when you can't trust the facts that are being shared with you in your board packs. You can't be wise if you don't have the truth. So that's one of the questions in the wider ethicability framework of what are the facts. So that's the I for integrity. G is for good, H is for harm. So I'm going to take them together because when we're making a moral decision, we are going to see winners and losers. People where the outcome is good and people where the outcome is harmed. And that's life. What we have to do is to maximize the good and minimize the harms. It's not a perfect world. Whenever we're making choices, there are going to be pluses and minuses. What we have to do is to see that those people who might be harmed, we minimize it and we compensate for it in some way. And we, crucially, a point we made earlier, we discussed earlier, was get them involved in the decision because they're grown-ups and they have a right to talk about that. So that's G and H. The final one is T for truth. And when I was constructing this acronym, I thought, what's the word I need for T? And it is the word truth. So the word truth is what a lot of your listeners will know as the front page test, the headline test in news media. And I've run moral reasoning sessions with a journalist who is there at the back of the room. So they're making a moral decision about a big issue they're facing. And the journalist is listening to the teams presenting their particular decision. And he's typing a headline live. I mean, it's not going live, but it's there on the big screen. And it's hilarious because what the journalist is able to do is to get the essence of the insanity or the awfulness of the decisions that are being proposed in a way that's safe and it's fun because, people say, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about it like that. Is that how it's going to play out? And I'll say to boards and leadership teams making decisions, imagine that I want one of you to play the journalist, an undercover journalist. And I want you to realize it's not just your decision, it's the reasoning behind your decision that actually counts and matters. And in fact, you can make a mistake. You can make the wrong decision because you don't know enough of the facts. But if you make that decision with integrity, then people will forgive you for it because we all make mistakes. We all fail from time to time. But if we err with integrity, then we're forgiven. And then we put it right.
I talk about that part of it quite a lot, particularly when it comes to good governance, which I don't see as bureaucracy. I see that as you say, that moral framework around how you make the decisions and the guardrails, let's say, so people know where they're going. But I think that that's so vitally important because, as you say, if you do things and the organisation, the people are known for doing the right thing, then that forgiveness level and sometimes that bounce back from failure or a trip or a stumble or whatever you want to call it can actually increase their reputational value afterwards because they think, you know what, they owned it. Totally. They accepted what happened. They're doing something about it and they genuinely want to do something about it. It's not just lip service. It's not just because, oh dear, it's hit the front page and now we have to do something. And those bits actually build, I think, on some of those people's careers and actually the defining moments for them and for their organisation.
Absolutely right. And if Ned's talk to complaints teams and see the power of a good resolution, you're turning a disgruntled customer into an advocate overnight by saying, we messed up, we're really sorry, and I'll tell you how sorry we are, we're actually going to compensate you for this. So, for example, John Lewis Partnership used to have a situation, I don't think they have it anymore, I might be wrong, But if you bought something, a vegetable which is actually off, they'd give you a replacement item and your money back. And that level of, if you like, confession, forgiveness and contrition, which many religions have, is something that most organizational cultures don't have. Because the system, the organizational system, tends to want to identify someone who can carry the blame as long as it's not me. And therefore there's no learnings. There's one sector where this doesn't happen because lives are at stake, and that's civil aviation. And when there's a near miss or an accident, the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK, and I think it's true across the world, have a no blame investigation. They do not assume any blame. They just want to get to the facts. Then if someone has acted recklessly, then there's an accounting for it. But if you start any investigation with the intent that I just need to understand what we all did wrong, because workplaces, organizations are systems. They're complex human social groups. No one person it's very rare that one person is responsible on their own. And you and I will have heard conversations, have seen investigations where someone somewhere in the organization, in fact, lots of people knew what was going on, but couldn't be heard by the people who needed to hear that. And some of this, the scandals, ongoing scandals and historic scandals, once the inquiry's finished, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people knew what were going on, but their voices were stifled because the system does not allow for truth to come out in a way that is healthy.
And how do you think that organizations can help build that? Because it comes from culture, right? It comes from those people at the top. I know from my own experiences as a leader, when things go wrong, which they do, I have that open conversation with somebody, and also I think it's really important to, amongst those people, to admit your own part in the downfall of whatever that is, and say, actually, if I had done this, or if I had asked that question, then we wouldn't be here. But everyone else, let's also open up and say, what is it? And that allows for learning and for growth. And I think that's one of the biggest things. That's what humans are all about, right from as soon as we're born. That is it. We learn from our mistakes, and hopefully we improve and we get better and we progress.
I think the answer is embedded in your question, and that it doesn't matter how senior you are in the organization, how much power you're seen to have. In fact, the more power they have, the more you have to admit mistakes. And also admit you don't know. The don't knows are important. I remember another situation where a CEO at a time of serious cost cutting, the team had done everything they thought they could. He went to see the group CEO and the group CFO, and he came back in the room and said, we need to find another 50 million in savings. It's just not enough, and I don't know where to begin. A CEO saying to his team, I don't know where to be. We've done it. And what happened? They didn't say stab him in the front, let alone stab him in the back. They all said, okay, let's go again. Let's do it again. Let's get other people in the room. We've obviously missed stuff. We're bound to have missed stuff. Let's do it again. So the answer to your question is, everyone in the organization, in any position of leadership, needs to model that behavior all the time. And say more often, I don't know, or I messed up, rather than this narcissistic dark trait that you see in too many leaders in organizations. Less so, I would say, the research says less so at board level, by the way, because most NEDs are relaxed a bit and not trying to prove anything. But we might come back to that. But really just, I think, modeling that behavior. And when I've been involved in culture transformation programs, and I've been involved in designing major culture transformation programs, it's based on moral values, moral purpose, moral reasoning, but it's actually based then executed through leadership action. It's not what leaders say that people follow, it's what they do. And when internal comms teams get that, and when boards stop agonizing over words and people actually say, I'm watching my leader and she or he is behaving in a way that inspires me, the engagement you get, the transformation in culture can be overnight. I'm not a believer that cultural transformation takes years. It does, because people don't understand it. And when people look at me and say, I don't think that's right, Roger, I say, well, when you were working and your boss changed, so your old boss left and a new boss came in and they were very different, how quickly did the culture in your team change, or your division, or your function? And the answer is virtually overnight. So that tells us that culture changes quickly through leadership, action, and behavior. And I think that's what boards need to take on board, and executive boards as well.
Do you think, so looking beyond boards, do you think organisations can grow morally over time? Do you think that the experiences that organisation faces can change them, or do you think that it always has to be, a new face, a fresh person in, a new perspective?
That's a really good question. Two answers. The first answer is that you have to get your design right. And by design, I mean the organization has to be a safe place for people to work. And I don't mean physical safety. That's a given. That's a law. But actually, we don't have a health and safety law about people feeling safe emotionally and mentally. And I've argued for it for a long time, that only when managers can be prosecuted for health and safety violations, for bullying, and so on and so forth, will that change. So the organization needs to be designed as a safe community for people to do their best. I mean, it's economically illiterate to assume that people will give of their best when they're scared. When we're scared, our whole being is focused on self-preservation, minimize harm, minimize losing my job. The mental overload, the emotional overload, means that the job you're paid to be doing doesn't get done very well. But when someone feels inspired and safe, the productivity goes through the roof. I've seen it happen hundreds of times. So you need to get the design of the organization right. But the second part is, and this is something really important that I think a lot of work needs to be done, is when people are hired, not just as non-executive directors, but executive directors and all the way through as leaders, they need to be assessed in terms of their moral character. And our research and other research shows that too many leaders display what psychologists call dark traits, which are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So narcissistic personality disorder is the major one. So people tend to be what has been called business idiots. They're just doing and saying everything for the look. They're not actually doing the job. They will manipulate and use their Machiavellian skills to manipulate the narrative. And they're just in it for themselves. The worst one, obviously, is the psychopathic trait. And these aren't clinical psychopaths. These are subclinical psychopaths who actually cannot empathize with the pain that colleagues are experiencing because of their behavior, or the products that their customers and the goods and services their customers are buying, and it's harming them. And the research shows that, for example, 15% of CEOs are subclinical psychopaths. So what the hell are nominations committees doing, or I should say not doing, in terms of screening out people with these dark traits? Organizational psychologists can do this. We can do this. I mean, airlines screen airline pilots for murder-suicide. so that they don't actually fly a plane into the side of the Alps. We know that's happened once. If we can do it for airline pilots and bus drivers, surely we can hire people who are people of good character first, and there's a lovely saying. The former chairman of Porsche Cars, Peter Schutz, said, "Hire character, train skill." What tends to happen in boards and in workplaces and in other leadership teams is people tend to hire skills and try and train character. It's not going to work. By the time we're in our early 30s, our character is pretty much set unless we suffer an extreme trauma. So there's two answers to your question. One is, yes, you have to create a safe culture for people to be their best. The other thing is, stop hiring people with dark traits. Hire people of good character.
And if you already have one of those people in your midst, there are options to move them on to all those sorts of things. But if you can't, how do you navigate that? Do you just make a decision that you have to step away?
Oh, if you don't have the power to remove them, well, if you're a board, you do.
Indeed.
But if it's the chair, then you've got a problem. If it's the CEO, you've got a problem. If it's the CFO, you've got a problem. So that's why the appointment of people with the most power in the organizations have to be doubly screened. And that's down to the people with power in the organization, which is down to the shareholders, because corporations are plutocracies. In other words, power comes from money. It doesn't come from personal identity. It's not a demos. It's not a democracy. It comes from money. And it's the people with money who have to say, okay, if we don't do the right thing, money is simply a promise we trust. If we break our promises and we destroy trust, we've just destroyed the value in our company. And that's ultimately where a corporate scandal will take you.
And what sort of interrogations, you touched on it lightly, what sort of interrogations should boards be making of these particular leadership roles when they come in as part of their onboarding process, or even before then, screening during interview, before they even have an offer on the table?
Yeah, well, it doesn't come through interviews. In fact, interviews are pretty bad at selecting the right people. You need to employ forensic psychologists who will then screen people. They'll go through a whole battery of tests. So I know that happens. Boards do employ psychologists, but they're tending to see if someone can read a balance sheet, profit and loss account, can write a report. Well, that's a lot less important than having someone who's a fully paid up member of the human race and is someone we can trust and someone who gives a damn about anything other than themselves. You can screen for that. And if you find someone who's got observable dark traits, then they don't go any further. That's it. That's, if you like, the black ball situation. They will not be part of our community.
Do you think those people can ever change?
Yes, they can, unless they're a clinical psychopath. So there is no way of treating clinical psychopaths, which is why they're normally jailed for life in an appropriate institution. In the UK, it's Broadmoor. Serial killers.
And hopefully they are not part of your leadership team.
No, but subclinical can be changed, but it requires a huge investment in time and money, and most organizations just aren't equipped to do it. So if you've made a mistake, then you need to manage them out in the right way, I should add.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you take us inside a moment when a boardroom was truly tested, and what shifted the conversation of that fear to courage?
It's difficult for me to talk about individual moments because most of my work is as an educator rather than a coach. So I've run lots of laboratory workshops where I've given them difficult decisions to practice on, but I'm not someone who sits in a boardroom and is there as the court jester.
What do you think are some of the hardest decisions then? If you've given them examples, what are some of those hard ones that humans just generally find very tricky, even the best?
And in a way, these safe hypothetical ones are the best because people relax a bit. And what's interesting for them to reflect on themselves. So as part of this education process, so I teach them how to make a good decision, the right decision. Then they start practicing on some safe hypothetical dilemmas, and then I get them to critique themselves. I normally break them up into 2 or 3 or 4 groups, which is a great way of making decisions. So boards normally are too big to have a single conversation that has meaning. So I break them up into 3s and 4s. The same question, and it's funny how they'll come up with slightly different answers, and you bring them together at the end. Anyway, so the dilemma that is the most powerful that I get them to write is what's called the letter of last resort.
Okay.
Now, the letter of last resort is written by every British Prime Minister the moment after they enter 10 Downing Street. So they say hello to the Cabinet Secretary, all the staff. Then the Cabinet Secretary takes them into the Cabinet room, sits them down with a plain paper and a fountain pen or a Sharpie pen or whatever. And the first job is to write the letter of last resort. 4 copies are made, and they go to each of our nuclear-powered Trident submarines, our Vanguard-class submarines, which hold our nuclear deterrent. And the letter of last resort is only opened by the commander of that boat in the event that Britain's been attacked by nuclear weapons and there is no communication from government. Basically, Britain's a pile of rubble and smoking ash. And you've got a Vanguard-class submarine in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean running silent. What do you do? So it's
a big question.
It is. And you can't think of a bigger question because we're in the middle of a nuclear exchange. And there are a number of options which we believe people consider. One is retaliate. Second, don't retaliate. Third, put your boat under the command of an allied nation that's still functioning. Or 4, do something else. Work it out for yourself. Can you imagine the level of moral argument and outrage and certainty that comes from that? And what happens is a large minority of people want to act out of revenge because it's natural. You know, my family at home has just been destroyed. All my friends, all my family. I want to get back at them. Well, first of all, you need to know who's attacked. You may not know. There are more than one possible enemies here. So assuming you do know, then how is the world going to be a better place if you land, the nuclear arsenal on a Vanguard-class submarine is very, very destructive. It would knock out every city in Russia. 100 million people plus would die. For what? What purpose? Killing everyone in the family who's killed your family is not going to bring them back, and you've just perpetuated it. And forget the fact that we've now created a nuclear winter that very few people are going to survive. So that option is often very quickly dismissed. No retaliation is, I think, the least popular. Putting yourself under the command of an allied country does get a lot of votes. Do something else gets a lot of votes as well. But it actually doesn't matter because it's a game. It's a big game and it's got huge outcomes. But what I'm interested in, what the participants love to see, is actually how they all navigate the biggest ever moral dilemma we've got. And it's actually happening right now, not in terms of a nuclear exchange, but if you look at climate change, the amount of energy we're putting into the atmosphere is a slow nuclear explosion, a slow nuclear winter or holocaust or whatever it is. But because it's happening in slow motion, most people don't see and feel it until they go to Italy and it's 50 degrees centigrade and their holiday's ruined. But it's the quality of that discussion that I think is the biggest learning thing. The moral decision-making framework, or whatever framework you use, is less important than actually having that conversation and seeing how your colleagues react. And people, I never knew you'd think that. It's actually amazing. And, can you imagine what it's like over a board dinner when I set that as a discussion? And it's certainly when a few glasses of wine have been flowing, it gets quite gritty.
I bet it does.
Quite quickly. But I think it's that, I don't want to emphasize, yes, we need a moral reasoning framework. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to be systems thinkers. But crucially, we need to know how to debate and argue with each other about things that matter without fear or favor. Does that make sense?
It does. And I guess that allows, in this scenario, boards to have those discussions about something that in principle doesn't matter. There is no right or wrong, but they can just stand by what they believe in and what's in their hearts.
Totally. And it's also something which is quite a good interview question.
I can imagine.
Especially when you've got, we know that group interviews are much more effective than one-on-one interviews. Not that happens at board level. Can you imagine a group interview between three potential NED candidates, shortlisted candidates? That could be fun. Does that ever happen?
No, that never happens. It would be more like some TV show, I guess.
I know. Maybe it should, Erika. Wouldn't that be fun?
It would definitely be interesting. What is one habit that listeners could adopt this week that would strengthen their moral compass?
I think the one habit that your listeners should practice is the golden rule. Put yourself in other people's shoes. Imagine what it's like to be your colleague across the board table. Get to know your colleagues really well. Get to know what's driving them. Get to know the narrative, the story of their lives. It happens at all levels. When we know that a colleague may be having, who's got an elderly relative who's dying, when we know that, the way we interact with them becomes different and better and more caring. When we can imagine what it's like to be an employee on the factory floor or in a contact center, that's helpful. Crucially, what it's like to be a customer or a client or a patient or, just an ordinary member of the public. Get out of your privileged bubble and not just imagine it, go and experience it. So put yourself in other people's shoes is, for me, consistent with this definition of morality, which is compassion is the basis for morality. Understanding how someone is feeling and then doing something about it is the root of morality.
So I think there were a number of elements that kind of came out of the interview with Roger. I think that fear and politics and the impact that has on decision making across everyone in an organisation is big. We obviously spoke about the impact that could potentially have on decisions getting to the boardroom in the first place, and also those decisions in the boardroom being heard for the true nature of which they are being brought. We also unpacked a number of different things around Roger's background, and I think it's always really interesting when you find out more about somebody, how his lived experience of having been a social worker in boroughs in London brings through the humanity that he then uses as part of his advisory, because the conversations that he has with boards, particularly with regards to the pension decisions that he was discussing, the 300 million, that does come down to humanity and listening to people and understanding other people's perspectives and being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes when you are making those decisions. And I think one of the key things that Roger said for board members to do is to consider the impact that the decision that they're about to make would have on all the various different people, and either role play or put yourself in that position of what would that person say to whatever the decision is that's being reached, and that's a good way of assessing whether or not you've considered these stakeholders and key people as part of the decision-making process. The fear factor is an interesting one, and the politics. He spoke about the two together, of saying that these influence decision-making in the way that things can play out, the amount of information that gets through to people, etc. And from my own experience, I would say that those two things, the politics and the fear, are key factors in whether or not an organisation has the ability to thrive, and the type of culture that it creates, and the type of individuals that want to work there. I know that Roger touched on a number of different personality traits within CEOs and leaders that would be red flags with regards to important decision making and how those people might approach that important decision making. And I think the more boards that can understand that their interview processes and that C-suite level people need to be properly assessed before they are allowed into that particular role, and it's not just a matter of they were the ex-CEO of whatever company that might be. I think that is really important because it will allow for better decision making moving forwards and just better outcomes for every stakeholder that touches that organisation, whether they work internally or externally. That's it for this episode of Grit in the Boardroom. Thanks to Roger for sharing his story with honesty and insight, and thank you for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please follow the show and share it with someone who leads through complexity. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay brave, and stay in the room.